There's a moment in every genuine spiritual awakening when the person you thought you were begins to dissolve. Not metaphorically, not poetically, actually dissolve. Your name stops meaning what it used to mean. Your reflection in the mirror looks foreign. The life you built suddenly feels like a costume you've been wearing for decades, and now the seams are splitting open. This isn't enlightenment, this is terror. And most people who reach this threshold turn back, or worse, they fragment completely and never recover. Carl Jung knew this. He lived it. And what he discovered in the depths of his own psychological unraveling is that spiritual awakening isn't about ascending into light. It's about descending into truth. And truth, when you finally meet it face to face, doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it breaks you first. This is the conversation almost no one in the spiritual community wants to have. We've turned awakening into a brand, an aesthetic, a lifestyle choice you can purchase with the right books and meditation cushions. But the real thing, the kind Jung talked about, the kind that actually transforms the structure of your psyche, that thing is dangerous. It demands everything: your identity, your certainties, your carefully constructed defenses against the chaos of existence. And here's what they don't tell you in the workshops and retreats. Most people who genuinely begin this process don't make it through. Not because they lack courage or commitment, but because awakening without proper psychological integration is like performing surgery on yourself without anesthesia or knowledge of anatomy. You might survive, but you'll be left with wounds that never properly heal. Welcome to Deep Psyche Lab. I'm here to guide you through the psychological labyrinth that Jung mapped during his own confrontation with the unconscious, the territory he called the collective unconscious, and what he learned about why genuine transformation is one of the most perilous journeys a human being can undertake. If this resonates with something you've been sensing but couldn't name, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're going deep into territory that most channels won't touch. This isn't about spiritual bypassing or feel-good platitudes. This is about the real mechanics of psychological death and rebirth, and why that process destroys more people than it transforms. Let's start with what spiritual awakening actually is, because the term has been so diluted that it now means almost nothing. In Jungian terms, awakening is the moment when the ego, that executive function of consciousness that you call yourself, encounters something vastly larger than itself. Jung called this the self with a capital S. It's not a religious concept, it's a psychological one. The self is the totality of your psyche, conscious and unconscious, the entire architecture of who you are beyond the small editorial board of thoughts you identify with. When these two meet, the ego and the self, it's not a gentle merging, it's a collision. The ego suddenly realizes it's not the center of your inner world. It's not even the author of most of your thoughts and behaviors. It's a construct, a useful fiction, a character in a much larger story being written by forces you've never acknowledged. This realization, when it hits, doesn't feel like peace. It feels like annihilation, because in a very real sense, it is annihilation. The structure you've spent your entire life building, the one that tells you who you are and how the world works, that structure begins to crumble. And here's where most people make the fatal mistake. They assume this crumbling is the destination. They think the goal is to dissolve the ego completely, to transcend it, to live in some perpetual state of egoless bliss. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding of the process, and it's precisely what leads to psychological fragmentation rather than integration. Jung experienced this firsthand. Between 1913 and 1916, he underwent what he carefully called his confrontation with the unconscious. Others might have called it a psychotic break. He heard voices, he saw visions. He felt himself pulled into a world of archetypal images and overwhelming psychological forces that threatened to consume his sanity entirely. He wrote about it later with clinical precision, but you can sense the terror underneath his words. He was a trained psychiatrist who had worked with schizophrenic patients, and he recognized in himself the same symptoms he'd diagnosed in others. The difference, and this is crucial, is that Jung maintained a thin thread of connection to his ego consciousness, even as he explored these depths. He developed a method he called active imagination, a way of engaging with the unconscious without being swallowed by it. He drew, he wrote, he recorded everything with scientific rigor. And this discipline, this commitment to conscious witnessing, even in the midst of dissolution, is what allowed him to survive and eventually integrate what he discovered. Most people attempting spiritual awakening don't have this framework. They dive into practices designed to dissolve the ego without understanding what they're actually doing. Meditation, breathwork, plant medicines, intensive retreats, these are powerful technologies for altering consciousness. They work, but they work by temporarily disabling the ego's defenses, the psychological structures that keep the unconscious at bay. When you do this without preparation, without psychological maturity, without a solid sense of self to return to, you're not opening a door. You're removing a load-bearing wall. The house doesn't expand. It collapses. Jung had a term for what happens when the ego inflates through contact with archetypal material. He called it psychic inflation. The person has a genuine spiritual experience, a moment of cosmic consciousness or unity or whatever language you want to use. They encounter something vast, something that feels infinitely wise and powerful. And instead of recognizing this as an encounter with the deeper layers of their own psyche, they identify with it. They think they've become enlightened. They think they're now operating on a higher plane than ordinary humans. They've touched the divine, and now they see themselves as divine. This isn't growth. It's a psychological pathology, and it's everywhere in spiritual communities. You've seen this person. Maybe you've been this person. They come back from a retreat or an experience, and suddenly they're speaking in spiritual cliches, talking about how they've transcended suffering, how they see through the illusion of the ego, how most people are asleep and they're finally awake. There's a grandiosity to it, a subtle arrogance masked in spiritual language. They're not more integrated, they're more fragmented. They've simply replaced one identification, the ego, with another identification, the self. And because the self is so much larger and more impressive than the ego, this new identification feels more real, more true, more important. But it's still identification. It's still the ego playing dress-up, now in cosmic robes instead of everyday clothes. The flip side of inflation is deflation, and this is often where the real danger emerges. Because what goes up in the psyche must come down. The person who inflated into spiritual grandiosity eventually crashes. Maybe their life circumstances don't magically improve despite their awakening. Maybe they realize they're still anxious, still angry, still struggling with the same patterns. Maybe someone challenges their new spiritual persona and they react with very unenlightened defensiveness. The cosmic identity can't sustain itself in the face of ordinary human limitation, and when it collapses, the person often falls into a depression darker than anything they experienced before, because now they've failed at the one thing they thought would finally fix them. They touched enlightenment and couldn't hold it. They saw the truth and then lost it. This failure feels metaphysical. It feels like proof of some fundamental inadequacy in their being. This is where people break. Some retreat further into spiritual fantasy, seeking more intense experiences, more dramatic practices, anything to recapture that initial moment of expansion. They become spiritual junkies, addicted to states of consciousness, rather than interested in genuine transformation. Others give up entirely, dismissing their experience as delusion or mental illness, closing down the connection to the unconscious completely. Both responses are forms of failure to integrate. Both represent a psyche that couldn't hold the tension between ego and self, between the human and the numinous, between daily life and cosmic truth. Jung understood that the goal isn't to destroy the ego. The goal is to relativize it, to recognize it as one structure among many in the psyche, necessary and useful, but not ultimate. He used the word circumambulation to describe the process of individuation, his term for psychological maturation. You don't move straight toward wholeness. You circle it. You encounter different aspects of the self, different archetypal energies, different unconscious contents, and you integrate them one by one. It's slow. It's messy. It requires enormous patience and humility. There's no graduation ceremony, no moment where you become fully individuated and the work is done. It's a lifelong process of consciously engaging with the unconscious, of bringing more and more of yourself into awareness, while accepting that you'll never bring all of it into the light. The shadow is where most spiritual awakenings fail. The shadow in Jung's framework is everything about yourself that you've repressed, denied, or failed to acknowledge. It's not evil. It's not darkness in a moral sense. It's simply the unlived parts of you, the rejected fragments, the aspects of your personality that didn't fit the image you needed to maintain. For most people pursuing spiritual awakening, the shadow contains aggression, selfishness, pettiness, jealousy, lust, greed, all the supposedly unspiritual qualities. And here's the paradox. You cannot awaken without meeting your shadow. You cannot integrate the self without first integrating the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. This is the work most people refuse. Because meeting the shadow doesn't feel spiritual. It feels degrading. You sit down to meditate seeking peace and transcendence, and instead, you're confronted with memories of moments you were cruel or cowardly or selfish. You open yourself to the unconscious expecting divine wisdom, and instead you encounter rage, sexual fantasies you've judged as inappropriate, resentments you thought you'd forgiven. The spiritual ego recoils from this material. It wants the light without the darkness. It wants ascension without descent. But Jung was unequivocal on this point. The shadow must be integrated before genuine transformation is possible. You have to own the parts of yourself you've disowned. You have to accept that you contain capacities you've morally condemned. Not to act them out, but to acknowledge them, to bring them into consciousness where they can be related to rather than projected onto others, or expressed unconsciously in destructive patterns. Most spiritual seekers skip this work. They use meditation and practices as a form of sophisticated repression, maintaining the split between good spiritual self and bad shadow self, just now with better justification. They're not avoiding their darkness because they're morally failing. They're transcending it because they're spiritually advanced. This is spiritual bypassing, and it's one of the most common ways people fail to survive their awakening, because the shadow doesn't go away when ignored. It grows, it gains energy, and eventually it erupts, often destroying the very spiritual identity the person has been trying to maintain. Jung wrote that the psychological rule is that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. What you don't own in yourself, you'll meet in your external circumstances. The spiritual teacher who preaches love and transcendence but hasn't integrated their shadow will eventually be caught in a scandal. The seeker who's trying to transcend their anger will find themselves in situations that provoke rage. The person avoiding their sexuality will become obsessed with it, either through compulsive acting out or rigid repression. This isn't punishment. It's the psyche's attempt to bring itself into balance. The unconscious will force integration one way or another. You can do it consciously through the painful work of shadow integration, or it will be done to you unconsciously through the circumstances of your life. There's another dimension to why people fail to survive their awakening, and it has to do with the inflation of meaning. When you touch archetypal material, when you have genuine encounters with the deeper layers of the psyche, everything feels significant. Synchronicities appear everywhere. Dreams feel prophetic. Random events seem to carry cosmic messages. This isn't delusion. These experiences are real. Jung spent much of his later life studying synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that can't be explained by cause and effect. But there's a crucial difference between recognizing synchronicity when it genuinely occurs and imposing archetypal meaning onto every random fluctuation of daily life. The person in the midst of awakening often can't make this distinction. Every bird that flies past their window is a message from the universe. Every song on the radio speaks directly to their situation. Every person they encounter is either a spiritual teacher or an obstacle placed in their path by fate. This is the psyche in a state of hypermeaning, where the symbolic function has been activated but hasn't yet learned discrimination. It's like suddenly seeing metaphor everywhere but not being able to distinguish between genuine metaphor and mere coincidence. This state can feel incredibly alive, incredibly connected. It can also be the early stages of psychosis. Jung knew this territory intimately. During his confrontation with the unconscious, he had to constantly question whether he was exploring the depths of the psyche or simply losing his mind. The phenomenology is often identical. The difference lies in whether you can maintain reflective consciousness, whether you can observe what's happening while it's happening, whether you can return to ordinary reality and function in it even as you're exploring extraordinary inner states. Most people attempting spiritual awakening don't have this capacity for dual awareness. They're either fully identified with ordinary consciousness, in which case they never really awaken, or they become fully absorbed in the archetypal realm, in which case they lose their grounding entirely. Grounding is not a sexy spiritual concept. It doesn't appear in the mystical literature much, but it's absolutely essential. Grounding means maintaining connection to the ordinary world, to your body, to practical concerns, to relationships that aren't organized around spiritual seeking. It means having one foot in the transcendent and one foot in the dirt, and being able to move between these dimensions without getting lost in either one. Jung was married, he had children, he maintained a psychiatric practice. He chopped wood, he built things with his hands. These weren't distractions from his inner work. They were the ballast that kept him from floating off into archetypal inflation. They were the anchor that allowed him to go as deep as he did into the unconscious without drowning. Most modern spiritual seekers lack this ballast. They organize their entire lives around awakening. They leave their jobs to attend retreats. They end relationships that don't support their spiritual path. They disconnect from family members who don't understand their journey. They create a life that's entirely oriented toward transformation, and in doing so, they remove the very structures that would allow genuine transformation to occur. Because transformation doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in the friction between your awakening consciousness and the ordinary demands of human life. It happens when you have to practice patience with a difficult colleague, even though you've just had a profound meditation experience. It happens when you have to pay your bills and take out the trash, even though you've glimpsed cosmic consciousness. This is where the rubber meets the road, where spiritual realization either integrates into your actual personality or remains a beautiful but disconnected experience. There's a reason Jung insisted that individuation was not the same as individualism. You don't individuate by separating from the world. You individuate by becoming more deeply yourself within the context of relationship and responsibility. The work is to bring your unique consciousness, your particular perspective and gifts, into full expression while remaining embedded in the human community. This requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to hold opposites in tension without collapsing into one pole or the other. You're simultaneously a unique individual and a member of the collective. You're both autonomous and interdependent. You contain personal, unconscious material and archetypal patterns shared by all of humanity. The mature psyche can hold all of this without needing to resolve the tension into simple answers. Most people can't tolerate this level of complexity. They want clear guidance. They want to know if they should follow their individual path or fulfill their social obligations. They want to know if their experience was genuine spiritual awakening or psychological pathology. They want certainty, and the process of genuine transformation refuses to provide it. You're constantly in the in-between, constantly holding questions that don't have final answers, constantly navigating between worlds without a fixed map. This ambiguity is part of the process, but it feels like failure. It feels like you're doing something wrong, like you should have more clarity by now. And this feeling of failure, this sense that you're not awakening correctly, often leads people to abandon the process or worse, to fake a certainty they don't feel. The performance of awakening might be the most subtle trap of all. You've had genuine experiences, you've glimpsed something real, but you can't live at that level of intensity constantly, and you can't fully explain what you've seen to others. So you begin to perform awakening. You adopt the language, the mannerisms, the lifestyle markers of enlightened people. You speak softly, you smile serenely. You talk about presence and non-attachment and living in the now. And maybe some of this is authentic expression of your actual state, but much of it, if you're honest, is persona. It's a spiritual mask you're wearing because you can't bear to admit that you're still struggling, still confused, still very much in process. The performance becomes a new prison, one that's harder to escape than the old identity because this one feels so much more important, so much more meaningful. Jung wrote about the persona as the mask we wear to meet the social world, the image we present that's not quite who we are. Everyone has a persona. It's necessary. But when you identify with the persona, when you believe you are the mask, you've created another barrier to genuine selfhood. The spiritual persona is particularly insidious because it masquerades as authenticity. The person thinks they're being more real, more true, more themselves, when actually they've just traded one set of social expectations for another. Now, instead of trying to be a good employee or attractive partner or successful professional, they're trying to be an awakened being. The content has changed, but the structure is identical. They're still performing for external validation. They're still measuring themselves against an ideal. They're still not living from their own center. To survive a spiritual awakening, you have to be willing to fail at being spiritual. You have to be willing to be mediocre, human, flawed. You have to come back down from the mountain peak of transcendent, experience and wash the dishes and feel annoyed at traffic and experience jealousy and notice your petty thoughts and accept all of it as part of the totality of who you are. This isn't settling for less. This is the actual work. Because the goal isn't to become something other than human. The goal is to become fully human, which means conscious of all your dimensions, light and shadow, spiritual and earthly, transcendent and embodied. Jung's concept of the wounded healer is relevant here. The healer who has never been wounded, who claims to have transcended suffering, cannot genuinely help others. They can only maintain their own inflation by positioning themselves as superior. But the healer who has been broken and has done the work to integrate that breaking, who carries their wounds consciously rather than inflicting them unconsciously on others, that person has something real to offer. They're not teaching from a position of having arrived. They're sharing from the ongoing process of becoming. This is the difference between genuine spiritual maturity and spiritual bypassing disguised as enlightenment. So what does it actually look like to survive a spiritual awakening? It looks like patience. It looks like humility. It looks like doing the unsexy work of shadow integration while everyone around you is chasing peak experiences. It looks like maintaining your ordinary life, your relationships and responsibilities while quietly deepening your inner work. It looks like therapy or analysis or some structured way of processing what's emerging from the unconscious. It looks like finding community that's mature enough to support genuine transformation rather than spiritual performance. It looks like reading Jung and other depth psychologists to understand the territory you're navigating. It looks like art, music, movement, any way of giving form to the formless content of the unconscious. It looks like routine and ritual, structure that holds you while your inner world reorganizes itself. Most importantly, it looks like time. Genuine transformation is not fast. The psyche moves at its own pace, and trying to accelerate the process usually backfires. Jung's own confrontation with the unconscious lasted years. His integration of that material continued for the rest of his life. He was still discovering new aspects of his own psychology, still encountering new archetypal patterns decades after his initial awakening. This is normal. This is the actual timeline of individuation. But we live in a culture that wants instant transformation, weekend enlightenment, spiritual awakening as a product you can purchase and possess. This cultural expectation collides with the psychological reality, and the collision destroys people. If you're in the middle of this process right now, if you've had experiences that open doors you can't close, if you're feeling disoriented or inflated or terrified or all of these at once, here's what you need to know. You're not broken. You're not failing. This is what the process actually feels like. The confusion, the doubt, the sense that you can't talk to anyone about what's happening because they wouldn't understand. This is the territory. Jung felt it. Every person who has genuinely walked this path has felt it. The difference between those who survive and those who don't comes down to whether you can hold the tension without resolving it prematurely, whether you can stay with not knowing, whether you can accept that you're in a liminal space between who you were and who you're becoming. And that liminal space might last longer than you'd prefer. You need to find ways to contain the energy. Journaling is one of the most powerful tools. Write down your dreams, your visions, your insights, your fears. Get them out of your head and onto paper where you can look at them with some objectivity. Active imagination, Jung's method, is another approach. You engage with the figures and images that appear in your inner world. You have conversations with them. You give them space to express themselves while maintaining your own perspective. This creates a relationship between ego and unconscious rather than a hostile takeover of one by the other. You might work with a Jungian analyst or a therapist trained in depth psychology. You need someone who understands this territory, who won't pathologize your experience or dismiss it as mere symptom. You also need to stay embodied. Exercise, dance, garden, cook. Do anything that connects you to your physical form and the physical world. The tendency during awakening is to float up into the mental and spiritual dimensions, to lose connection with the ground. Your body is not the enemy of awakening. Your body is the container that allows awakening to stabilize into something sustainable. Jung was emphatic about this. The alchemists he studied talked about bringing the spirit down into matter, about the incarnation of consciousness into physical form. This is what integration means. Not ascending out of your body into pure spirit, but bringing the spirit into your body, into your actual life, into the way you show up in the world. And you need to be realistic about what awakening actually changes. It doesn't solve your psychological problems. It often amplifies them by removing the defenses that kept them hidden. Your trauma doesn't disappear. Your anxiety or depression doesn't vanish. Your relationship patterns don't automatically heal. Awakening gives you access to resources you didn't have before. Deeper levels of your psyche that can support your healing and growth. But you still have to do the work. You still have to face what you've been avoiding. You still have to make different choices, develop new skills, build new patterns. Spiritual awakening is not a shortcut around human development. It's an intensification of it, a call to engage more deeply with your actual psychological reality rather than transcending it. Let me be clear about something. Everything I'm describing, everything Jung mapped, this isn't theory. This isn't abstract philosophy. This is lived experience analyzed with psychological precision. Jung nearly lost his mind exploring these depths. He knew the danger firsthand, and he spent the rest of his career trying to create frameworks that would allow others to navigate this territory more safely. His work on archetypes, on the collective unconscious, on synchronicity, on alchemy as psychological metaphor, all of it was his attempt to build a map of the unmappable, to provide some guidance for a journey that each person ultimately has to make alone. The tragedy is that most people attempting spiritual awakening never encounter Jung's work, or if they do, they treat it as another intellectual system rather than a practical guide to navigating psychological transformation. They're reading books about enlightenment written by people who inflated into spiritual grandiosity and never came down. They're following teachers who are performing awakening rather than living it. They're in communities that reinforce spiritual bypassing and punish honest acknowledgement of struggle. And without real guidance, without a framework for understanding what's happening, they're navigating a psychological minefield blindfolded. Here's a question to sit with. What if your spiritual awakening isn't about becoming enlightened? What if it's about becoming human? What if the entire journey is about descending into your full humanity rather than ascending out of it? What if the darkness you're afraid to face, the shadow you're trying to transcend, the ordinary life you think you need to escape, what if all of that is exactly where you need to go? Jung believed that we don't achieve wholeness by eliminating half of ourselves. We achieve it by consciously relating to all of ourselves, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, spiritual and earthly. The goal isn't perfection, it's completion, not becoming some impossible ideal of an awakened being, but becoming entirely yourself, which includes dimensions you've never acknowledged. This is difficult. This is humbling. This doesn't look like the spiritual awakening marketed to you, but it's real, and it's survivable. Not only survivable, but generative, capable of producing genuine transformation that lasts, that integrates, that makes you more fully human rather than less. The people who survive their spiritual awakening are the ones who give up the fantasy of transcendence and embrace the reality of incarnation, who stop trying to escape their humanity and start exploring its depths, who accept that awakening is not a destination you reach, but a tension you learn to hold. If this message is reaching you at a moment when you need it, when you're struggling to make sense of what's happening in your inner world, I want you to know that you're not alone in this. The path is ancient. The territory has been mapped by those who walked it before you. Jung's work is there for you. The entire depth psychology tradition is there. And communities of people doing this work honestly, without inflation or bypassing, they exist. You just have to look beyond the surface level of spiritual culture to find them. Before we close, I want to emphasize that this channel is educational and not a substitute for therapy. If you're struggling with mental health challenges, please reach out to qualified professionals who can provide appropriate support. If this video resonated with something you've been living but couldn't name, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps this content reach others who might need to hear it. and drop a comment with the phrase, "I choose integration." Let's build a community of people committed to the real work, not the performance. Subscribe to Deep Psyche Lab for more explorations into the depths of human consciousness, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. We're just getting started with this material, and there's so much more to uncover together. The work continues, the journey deepens, and you're exactly where you need to be, even if it doesn't feel like it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this difficult work. And thank you for choosing depth over distraction, integration over inflation, humanity over the fantasy of transcendence. Until next time, stay conscious.